Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, we've got to assess certain claims that Iran and the United States prevented a false flag attack on U.S. soil.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds outrageous. People will hang on a minute. How's that even possible? But I want to put a bit of context on this before we get into it. Let's look at the absolute clear, unequivocal evidence that shows that even though the United States, in some capacity or other, attacked nuclear sites in Iran, they were all evacuated beforehand. Obviously, enriched uranium was moved. There was clearly collusion with the Iranians in this regard to say, look, we're going to have to do this. And on that basis, minimal damage, no real imposition in terms of the progress of Iran's nuclear program. And then, lo and behold, 24 hours later, given there's more collusion, the Iranians go in and make a big statement that they obliterated, destroyed, I don't know, whatever adjective you want, the Al Udeid base in Qatar, which is the US's biggest base in West Asia. But of course, what a surprise. The United States evacuated the base beforehand. There was a few missiles fired, and that was it. So if they're prepared to collude in that regard, with regards to those events, then why would it be out of the ordinary for the Iranians to collude with the United States, excuse me, to prevent a false flag attack on their soil? Now, recall we did, I can't remember, a couple of weeks ago, a podcast saying the threat of a false flag attack was very real and we had to take it seriously. And that could have involved all manner of things, particularly with regards to US assets in obviously West Asia itself. That could have been bases, it could have been US military hardware. But also, we did say there was the risk and the potential that there could be a false flag on US soil. And that obviously, if that was to happen, it would have to be clearly pinned on the Iranians because there are clearly elements both in the United States and Israel for that matter. So we can't apportion who is responsible for this. People can make their own assessments as to who they think is responsible. It is very unprofessional and unwise to apportion blame specifically on anyone because we don't have the evidence to know whether that's the case or not. But clearly, there are elements both there in those two countries who would like to see a full scale war between the United States and Iran. I don't think anyone should be remotely shocked by that statement. So when you start to put this context together and then say, well, as much as the United States and Iran can be seen as adversaries, if there's something of mutual interest, then they can cooperate and work together. There are even claims, of course, that the United States has offered some kind of partial relief from sanctions for the Iranians. Not entirely sure that's clear what. There are statements about China being able to be in receipt of Iranian oil, but frankly, they have anyway. Although, if you officially announce it, of course, it means all the loop, all the whole hoops you have to jump through to evade them. You no longer have to do so. But again, that would, if indeed to be the case, even if it's just a logistical approval as opposed to the fact that everyone circumvents sanctions anyway in that regard. But again, it's cooperation between the two countries. So what I'll do there is I'll give way to you, Ken, and then we can come back onto the nuts and bolts or the meat of what these claims are with regards to thwarting this false flag attack on US soil.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in many instances, when you have something like this, there's always going to be the potential for somebody to scream, "Oh, conspiracy theorists, blah 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 blah." Well, the reality is that there are pieces of a puzzle that have been out there leading up to this. Now, it doesn't mean we can make a definitive answer. This country did this to, and boom, we don't know. But when you take a look at a number of different things, what it does is opens the door to be able to discuss and analyze just this type of thing. Back on the 7th of June, there was a big announcement that the Islamic Republic of Iran had hacked into Israel's database and got a lot of information regarding their nuclear program and a lot of different strategic things. So, potentially, is this something that was found in those documents? We don't know. But it was shortly after this that Israel made its first salvo into Tehran, going after their infrastructure. So, with also something that has been sticking in my mind, and that's why is President Trump going so sulfurically that he destroyed the Iranian nuclear facilities and obliterated them, and there's no question. And he's attacking anybody who dares question whether they were destroyed or not. I think there's a real reason behind this because it forces anyone, particularly in this case Israel, that, hey, you have no reason to carry on the conflict with Iran because their nuclear program has been destroyed. Let it go. It's done. Enough.
Yeah, absolutely. But also ironically, the Iranian Israelis said that as well. So they've kind of countenanced the very argument used. But yes, it's an important statement to make. But let's get into the nuts and bolts of this. What the allegations are and the statements are is that some elements were plotting to carry out some kind of false flag on US soil. Then clearly the intention was to blame Iran. Why? Because then that could be used as a provocation to launch a full-scale war between the United States and Iran. Now, I just want to mention something here before we carry on with this. If the United States, because there's a lot of belief out there the US is being desperate for a war with Iran for a very long time. There are elements for sure who do, but there are a lot of elements in the United States who just do not want to go there for very obvious reasons. And we're not going to repeat those. But if the United States seriously wanted to go to war with Iran, the last thing they're going to do is allow them to bomb a base. Okay, it was emptied in Qatar. They're not going, they would have used that as an excuse to go, oh, you've committed an act of serious aggression on the United States. We're now going to declare war on you, effectively. They didn't do it because there was this agreement clearly between the two countries and the fact the United States does not want to go to war with the Iranians because the United States is in no position to go to war with the Iranians, given their bases are sitting ducks, their naval fleet is sitting ducks, and what's the US going to do? Invade Iran with what? Iran has a military force of at least 1 million people, with reserves included, of course. So, what clearly there are elements somewhere, as we said, whether it's elements in the US or in Israel, and maybe not exclusively those regions or those countries who want to say to the United States, this is a blatant attack on US soil, and therefore you would have to respond. And frankly, if something did happen, and clearly it didn't happen, but if it did and Iran was responsible, the US is going to have to take very serious action if that was indeed the case. So if you orchestrate some kind of false flag on US soil, then of course, I mean, we've seen this before, and I'm not going to get into specifics, but evidence is fabricated. Then it's claimed we have all the evidence that proves that Iran was responsible. And then, of course, can you imagine what would happen terms of public opinion in the United States. There'd be absolute fury because this would be akin to, in a different way, what happened with 9/11. And then, of course, that would then be the catalyst for the United States to have to pursue military action in a very concerted way against the Iranians. Now, the other claim is that Iran received intelligence from a so-called friendly country who discovered a plot. And after Iran receiving this information about this supposed attack on US soil, the Iranians sent this intelligence to US officials, and then they managed to prevent this planned incident, which presumably involves some kind of, which wouldn't be a military incident, but it would have involved firearms or worse in some capacity or other. Now, the immediate question with regards to that would be, what friendly country would have given the Iranians that intelligence? Now, people immediately jump to conclusions and go, it could be the Russians, it could be the Chinese. It's possible, but it could also be the Saudis, because the Saudis and the Iranians have had significant rapprochement for a considerable period of time. The Saudis actually let the Iranians use their airspace to launch missiles to target Israeli cities. Now, I'm not saying it is Saudi. I'm just saying there could be a number of countries who you perceive to be friendly countries who would give them that intelligence. Now, with all due respect, I don't think Syria you would regard as a friendly country because Assad's gone. I don't think it's going to be Lebanon. I mean, and I don't think it's probably the UAE either. I doubt it's Oman or Kuwait, or Jordan. So, if I was to have an educated, I wouldn't call it guess or speculation, I wouldn't think it was the Chinese. I would say Saudi first and Russia second. And the question, therefore, on that basis is, how did they become in receipt of that intelligence? And I wouldn't be surprised if there are elements inside whoever's responsible, whether it's a domestic matter, whether it could have been someone in Israel responsible, who has gone, we can't allow this to happen. And let's be honest, if you're sat there in the Middle East or West Asia, and you're anticipating a full-scale war between the United States and Iran, I think you could see why the Saudis, and for that matter, anyone else in the Middle East, would go, we don't want this to happen based on a false premise, because we're going to get engulfed in this. And these countries cannot afford to have that kind of crisis happening because it could create massive instability in their own countries. And Saudi Arabia's House of Saud could therefore then potentially be in a perilous state themselves. So maybe on that basis, it could have been someone from the UAE or Qatar or someone. But it wouldn't surprise me if it was someone from that region who's going, we can't afford to allow a war of that magnitude to come about on the basis of false allegations made against the Iranians. Now, people say, why aren't you sticking your neck out on the line with regards to who is responsible? Well, because what's the point? We could say it was someone in the America or in the US who's responsible. We could say it was the Israelis who are responsible. We could say it was a third party who's responsible, but doing the dirty work of one of those two parties. We don't know. And speculating is of no value. We don't do that. And if we do speculate, we'll be very specific that we are. But I'm not going to get drawn into that level of speculation on the basis of the assessing these claims, because it's of enormous gravity and it's not a trivial subject. And therefore, it will be crassly irresponsible to try and suggest who could have been responsible. At the end of the day, though, if indeed, and I'm sure in the fullness of time, this will become more common knowledge. And also, I think, therefore, whoever was responsible at some point, that's likely to become known, but maybe not for a considerable period of time. But the fact that there are these allegations and the fact that this was thwarted on US soil, I think that will have sharpened minds up inside the Trump administration with regards to the fact of the instability that that could have caused domestically. I mean, at the end of the day, if it happened, what could it may have done to the Trump administration itself? If something of that nature happens, that can seriously undermine Trump's administration in the process. So they're going to have to think, and if they're aware of who is responsible, and the argument probably is they know, then they're going to have to act accordingly on that basis and either realize we have serious issues domestically to deal with, or there is a third party nation involved. And I know a lot of people will want to point the finger at Israel and say, well, it must be that. Well, you can think that if you want to do so. I'm not going to be prepared to make a similar statement because I mean, it's an easy target to and a soft target to make the accusation of against. But what I would say is, if this indeed these claims are correct, then the United States has a huge problem that fortuitously it's averted because a full-blown war in West Asia would be disastrous not just for the United States and Iran, but for the entire region, and it could have escalated into a very, very ugly conflict as a result of that.
You know, when President Trump ordered the B-2 bombing attack on the nuclear sites, obviously, definitely me and then a number of people in the quote unquote MAGA community looking on the surface really were divided about doing this. Oh, the promise, the campaign promise of we're not going to get involved in wars, et cetera, et cetera. But as time always goes by, you can have more and more information come out, and you can take a look and make assessments, and even up to a point, educated speculations on why certain things were done. In particular, if there was a threat, that there was going to be an escalation going on, you know, perhaps in the conflict between Iran and Israel, of nukes being used or uh, tactical nukes being used at those facilities. Well, Trump going in there and doing the bombing himself is a great way to cut that out, especially since it appears more and more that Iran was notified in advance this was happening, or they had information, so they were able to get their uh, enriched uranium out. And likewise, the United States was notified and they got their personnel out of the Qatari base, and then an empty base was bombed. So there was a lot of coordination on this for more of a optical attack to placate a number of different sides. And if you think about it, President Trump is being pressed by a number of different factions. The lobbies want him to do X, Y, and Z for them, et cetera, et cetera. So he's being juggling around. And I'm reminded of what happened during his first administration. I think you and I were on a radio podcast doing this when the night this occurred. But if you remember when France and a couple other countries were going to bomb Damascus under the claim of taking out their chemical weapons, and Trump intervened and just did his own raid, pretty much cutting them off at the knees. Now, not a lot of damage was done, but he was able to, by showing that little bit of force, be able to pretty much keep escalation from taking place where NATO may have gotten involved or the Euro Chihuahuas would have gotten involved. And we didn't see anything after that. This may have been the same instance. And if they got information from Iran or from that third party that this is a potential thing, then he had to act and do something that would keep the escalation from going not just between the current conflict, but getting the U.S. involved and getting potentially other nations in West Asia involved. Because I guarantee if this thing expanded, you know that the NATO chihuahuas would all want to be involved in this.
Yeah, I think they'd want to be involved, but they wouldn't be allowed. But your point stands that this would have been a way of heading off a lot of problems and trying to then put a ceasefire in place. I mean, okay, whether the ceasefire holds is we don't know, and that's a whole separate matter, and we're not going to cover all ground in that regard. But yeah, undoubtedly, the decision made to do when it was collusion, absolutely between the Iranians and the United States with regards to Fordo and the Al Udeid base. It could be in relation to this intelligence where they've both gone, well, this risk of a false flag was averted, but we also have to therefore diffuse what's going on in between the Iranians and the Israelis, and this is a way of doing it. Now we're speculating here. Not necessarily putting two and two together and making four, but I think that's probably a good point to stop from my perspective, unless obviously you've got something else you want to add, Ken.
No, I think we covered quite a bit and on this topic here, but it was an important one to obviously bring up and take a look at, analyze.
Yeah,
Paul, thank you as always for being a part of the discussion.
yeah, likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.